The wind, a constant, keening lament across the jagged peaks of the Carpathian Range, scoured the stone and snow of a forgotten valley. It was a place that existed outside of time, a crumpled piece of paper in the vast atlas of Eastern Europe, its name lost to all but the most detailed of regional surveys, and even those were decades old. The fir trees, heavy with winter's burden, stood as silent black-green sentinels against the relentless white. From above, from the sterile, vacuum-cold perspective of orbit, it was a study in monochrome, a texture of untouched wilderness. This was a non-place, a blank spot, the kind of location that cartographers, in a different age, might have marked with the cautious notation "Hic sunt dracones," here be dragons. On a crystal-clear morning in late January, a different kind of dragon was watching. It was a NATO RQ-4 Global Hawk, an unblinking, pilotless eye cruising at 60,000 feet, its synthetic aperture radar painting the terrain below in strips of data no human eye could see. Its mission was routine, a wide-area survey mapping exercise, part of the endless, quiet ballet of post-Cold War observation. The data streamed down, a torrent of ones and zeros, to a processing station at RAF Molesworth in the UK, where it was filtered, analyzed, and catalogued by algorithms designed to flag anomalies. Most days, the algorithms found nothing. This was not most days. A junior analyst, sipping lukewarm tea from a chipped mug, was the first to see it. The flag was minor, a Class C anomaly, unexplained linear feature. He clicked, zooming in on the coordinates. The high-resolution image resolved on his screen. It was the valley, pristine and white, the shadows of the peaks stretching long and blue in the low morning sun. And there, cutting across the virgin snowpack, were a series of parallel lines. He adjusted the contrast, enhancing the image. They were unmistakable. Tire tracks, not the narrow, meandering tread of an animal, nor the single, purposeful line of a skier. These were the wide, dual-track patterns of vehicle tires pressed deep into the snow as if bearing significant weight. They ran from the northeast, following the contour of a long, dry riverbed, and then they stopped. They didn't fade out. They didn't loop back. They simply terminated in the dead center of the valley floor, at the base of a massive, scree-covered slope. The analyst frowned, his tea forgotten. He pulled up the archived imagery for the same location from the previous week. Nothing. Pristine snow. He checked the weather data. There had been a heavy snowfall 48 hours prior, followed by clear, cold skies. These tracks were fresh, laid down within the last 36 hours. But that was impossible. The valley was a box canyon, surrounded on three sides by impassable cliffs. There were no roads, no trails, not even hunter's path on any map, civilian or military, going back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a cartographic dead end. A vehicle couldn't just drive in and vanish. He flagged it for his supervisor, a weary-faced squadron leader with 20 years of intelligence experience. The supervisor leaned over his shoulder, studying the screen. "Probably a glitch in the processing," he muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. "Run it through the IR overlay. Let's see if there's any residual heat." The analyst complied, pulling the data from the Hawk's infrared sensors. The thermal image painted a new and far more disturbing picture. The valley floor was cold, a uniform deep blue and purple. But at the point where the tracks terminated, at the base of that colossal slope, there was a faint, almost ghostly signature. It wasn't a hot spot, it was something else. A series of long, thin, rectangular shapes, cooler than the surrounding rock, but ever so slightly warmer than the deep frozen earth. They were buried. The shapes were perfectly straight, unnaturally geometric, arranged in parallel like the teeth of a comb. They measured roughly 50 meters in length, 10 in width. The pattern was chillingly familiar to anyone who had ever studied aerial reconnaissance. Hangars, the supervisor breathed, the word hanging in the air-conditioned hum of the operations center. Bloody hell! Someone built hangars under the mountain! A frantic, silent scramble began. They cross-referenced every database they had access to. Soviet military construction records seized after the fall of the Berlin Wall showed nothing. East Bloc intelligence files, painstakingly digitized, were silent. German Wehrmacht engineering reports from their advance into the region in 1941 made no mention of it. It was a ghost, a secret that outlasted the Third Reich, the entire Cold War, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. The intelligence community, a beast that thrives on secrets, had found one that was not its own. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just an abandoned Cold War relic. The tire tracks were fresh. The thermal signatures, while faint, suggested recent activity. The buried facility, whatever it was, had been dormant, sleeping like a dragon in its lair for decades. And now someone had woken it up. Deep within the mountain, the air was thick and still, carrying the scent of cold stone, aged concrete, and the faint metallic tang of aviation fuel. It was the smell of a tomb that had been unsealed. The only light came from a string of dim utilitarian bulbs that ran along the arched ceiling, their yellow glow pushing back the darkness just enough to reveal the monumental scale of the cavern. It was a cathedral of shadows, hewn not by nature, but by the relentless, paranoid will of man. The walls were rough-hewn granite, showing the drill marks of the miners who had carved it out, their names and fates long lost to history. Massive, pre-stressed concrete ribs arched overhead, holding back millions of tons of mountain. The floor was smooth concrete, stained with decades of oil and grease. And resting on that floor, in the eerie half-light, were the reason for this impossible place. 3 aircraft stood in a silent row, each housed in its own individual bay, separated by colossal blast doors that could slide shut on rusting tracks. They were not like any planes in a modern air force. Their lines were strange, anachronistic, yet possessed of a brutal functional beauty. 2 were transports, their high wings and bloated fuselages identifying them as Antonov AN-2s, the legendary Soviet biplanes, workhorses of the skies, known for their ability to land and take off from a postage stamp. But these were different. Their canvas skins were painted in a bizarre, non-reflective matte black, and their registration numbers had been meticulously scrubbed away, leaving only ghostly patches on the fuselage. It was the 3rd aircraft that commanded attention. It was a monster, a Lockheed C-130 Hercules, its 4 massive turboprop engines silent and still. But this Hercules was a ghost from a past era. Its paint scheme was not the gray of modern air forces, but a patchwork of deep forest green and black, a relic of a time when aircraft flew low to avoid radar. Its tail number was filed off, its national insignia, a carefully applied, non-standard blotch of neutral color. It was a spook plane, a deniable asset, the kind of aircraft that didn't officially exist, operated by people who didn't officially exist, for missions that would never be acknowledged. Beneath the port wing of the Hercules, a figure moved. He was a man in his late 50s, his face a roadmap of a hard-lived life, etched with lines that spoke of squinting into sun-drenched skies and the relentless pressure of high altitude. He wore a worn leather jacket over a simple gray flight suit devoid of any patches or rank. This was Alexander Volkov. Once, a long time ago, he was a major in the Soviet Air Force's Special Purpose Aviation Wing, a pilot trusted with the USSR's most sensitive and clandestine missions. Now he was something else, a caretaker, a ghost, the master of this hidden kingdom. He ran a hand, calloused and scarred, along the Hercules's cold aluminum skin. His fingers traced a barely perceptible seam where a patch had been welded over old shrapnel damage. The memory of that night, decades ago, flashed behind his eyes. The shudder of the airframe, the frantic shouts over the intercom, the smell of cordite and fear, the desperate, engine-screaming climb to get above the SAM envelope over the Hindu Kush. And Volkov had been left as its guardian, a forgotten soldier guarding a forgotten secret. For 30 years, he had lived here, a hermit in the mountain, with a small, equally discreet team. They maintained the systems, ran the generators, kept the corrosion at bay. It was a lonely, monastic existence, punctuated by quarterly supply drops from a private aviation company that asked no questions. He had watched the world change from the flickering screen of a shortwave radio and the occasional smuggled newspaper. The wall fell. Nations were reborn. The world he had sworn to defend ceased to exist, and still he remained. Out of duty? Habit? Or was it because deep down he knew a day like this would come? The sound of boot heels on concrete echoed through the cavern, sharp and intrusive. A man approached, younger, dressed in modern tactical gear, his face cold and professional. He was the representative of the new owners, the men who had found the records of Volkator in some dusty archive in Moscow and recognized its potential. They were not a state. They were something far more fluid and dangerous. A consortium of private military contractors, intelligence brokers, and oligarchs with nebulous allegiances. They called themselves the Charter. The final payload arrives at 0200, the man said, his voice clipped, devoid of the rough, familiar tone Volkov's old crew had used. The mission profile is insanity, Volkov said, his voice a low rumble. A low-level, nap-of-the-earth flight through 3 sovereign airspaces using Cold War-era navigation systems to a drop zone that hasn't been active since Brezhnev was in power. In this, he gestured to the ancient aircraft. It's a suicide run. The Charter does not pay for opinions, Captain Volkov. It pays for results. The asset must be delivered. The world is watching, though it does not yet know what it is looking for. This flight will change things. You are a part of history. History, Volkov spat the word. I have had my fill of history. It always ends with good men bleeding out in the snow for a cause they've forgotten. The money has been transferred to the account in Cyprus, as agreed. Your crew's families have been provided for, generously. That is the cause. That is the only cause that matters now. The man turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the hum of the underground generators. Volkov was alone again with his ghosts and his machine. He looked up at the Hercules, at the old, familiar scars. It was an impossible mission, a flight born from the cynical calculus of a new, shadowy world order. But the man was right about one thing. He was a part of it now. The hidden airfield was awake. The dragon had stirred. And as the first pre-dawn light began to brush the peaks high above, unseen and unknown to the world, the impossible mission began to unfold. The hangar doors, cleverly disguised as a section of the mountainside, would soon begin to grind open on long, unused mechanisms, ready to unleash its anachronistic ghost into the breaking day. The analyst's name was Liam Connolly, and for 72 hours he had lived and breathed the enigma of the Carpathian Rally. He'd slept in fits and starts at his terminal, his dreams haunted by spectral tire tracks that led into the mouths of caves. The initial quiet curiosity at RAF Molesworth had curdled into a high-priority, compartmentalized investigation. The anomaly now had a classified designation, Pantom Echo. The number of people cleared for Pantom Echo could fit in a single conference room, and the atmosphere in that room was thick with a potent mixture of professional fascination and cold dread. They had thrown every asset they had at the valley. A second Global Hawk equipped with even more sophisticated LiDAR and hyperspectral imaging sensors was diverted from a monitoring mission over the Baltic Sea. The Americans had brought a keyhole satellite to bear, its powerful lenses capable of reading a license plate from orbit. But here, it was frustrated by the perpetual winter haze and the deep, concealing shadows of the peaks. The data that came back was paradoxically both revealing and deeply confusing. The thermal signatures persisted, a ghostly warmth bleeding through the cold rock. The algorithms enhanced the imagery of the slope, and now, with the benefit of extreme magnification and shadow analysis, they could just make out the faint, almost imperceptible lines of seams in the rock face. They were too straight, too regular to be natural geological formations. They outlined a rectangle nearly 80 meters wide and 30 tall. "It's a door," the squadron leader had stated, his voice flat. "A bloody great big door, but a door that showed no mechanism, no hinge, no handle. It was a puzzle box made of granite and steel. For 3 days it remained stubbornly, infuriatingly shut. Then on the 4th night, everything changed. It was during the satellite's 0300 local pass. The valley was a pool of ink, the moon shrouded by high, thin cloud. In the operations center, the live feed was a study in shades of green and black, the infrared spectrum painting a world of heat and its absence. Liam, his eyes gritty with exhaustion, was monitoring the feed, watching the cold, dark shape of the mountain door. For an hour, nothing, then a flicker. A single, thin, horizontal line of warmth appeared, a hairline fracture of heat across the center of the disguised door. It glowed a faint, sullen orange in the infrared spectrum. "Sir," Liam said, his voice tight, "I've got something. Thermal anomaly at the target." The squadron leader was at his shoulder in an instant. "What is it?" "A linear heat signature, right across the door, like a seam." And as they watched, the line brightened. It was as if a giant element was warming up behind the rock. Then the impossible happened. The line began to widen. The top half of the massive door was tilting outward, swinging up and away from the mountain face on hinges of unimaginable strength. A wave of warm air, trapped for decades within the mountain, rushed out, creating a visible plume in the cold night air, a shimmering heat haze that distorted the star field behind it. The LiDAR scan went wild, mapping the precise mechanical movement, calculating the door's thickness at over 2 meters of reinforced concrete and steel, faced with a masterfully engineered rock veneer. And then they saw it. The mouth of the steel cave. The interior was a slash of shocking, brilliant white and yellow in the IR world, a stark contrast to the cool blues and purples of the night. It was an artificial dawn spilling from the heart of the mountain. The light illuminated the cavernous interior, revealing the arched ceiling, the smooth floor, and the beginnings of a runway that stretched back into the glowing depths. It was a sight that defied belief, a fully functional subterranean airfield, a relic of a bygone era's paranoia, now shockingly, undeniably active. A collective, stunned silence filled the operations center. They were witnessing the unveiling of a secret that had been buried longer than most of them had been alive. Then, a shape emerged from the blinding light. It rolled slowly, tentatively, to the very threshold of the door, pausing as if sniffing the cold air. It was not the hulking, anachronistic form of the Hercules Liam had half expected to see. This was something else entirely. The silhouette was wrong. It was sleek, predatory, a dagger shape of pure function. It was painted a flat, light-absorbent black that made it seem like a hole cut in the fabric of the night. There were no right angles, no protruding canopies or intakes that would betray its presence to radar. The engine intakes were wide, shallow slits on top of the fuselage, shielding the fan blades from ground-based radar, a design philosophy reminiscent of the American B-2 Spirit bomber. But the tail assembly was what truly confounded them. It had no vertical stabilizers. It was a pure flying wing, but one with a sharp, arrow-like profile that suggested it was built for speed as well as stealth. This was no slow, high-altitude observer. This was an interceptor. "What in the name of God is that?" someone murmured. It was a hybrid, a chimera, a machine that combined the radar-evading contours of a fifth-generation stealth aircraft with the aerodynamic profile of a high-speed interceptor. It was a design that theoretical papers had hinted at, that aviation magazines had speculated about, and glossy artists' impressions, but one no nation, not the US, not Russia, not China, had ever admitted to building, let alone deploying. Liam felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was beyond a hidden airfield. This was a hidden technology, a ghost plane. On the screen, the black aircraft began to move. It taxied slowly out of the mountain's mouth, its landing gear squat and robust, onto a prepared, compacted snow apron that fronted the hidden hangar. It turned smoothly, aligning itself with the valley floor. There was no visible pilot canopy. It was unmanned. For a moment, it sat there, a silent, dark predator against the snow. Then, with a suddenness that was jarring, a plume of superheated air and exhaust blasted from its rear. It was not the bright orange flare of a conventional jet, but a pale, shimmering, almost transparent distortion, the signature of a high-bypass turbofan engine, optimized for both power and reduced heat signature. The snow behind it melted and boiled away in an instant, sending up a cloud of steam that momentarily obscured the satellite's view. When it cleared, the aircraft was already moving. It accelerated with a ferocious, terrifying speed that seemed to defy physics. It did not lumber down the valley. It leapt. It used barely a third of the available space, its nose tilting up while its main gear were still firmly on the ground, and then it was airborne, climbing at a near vertical angle that strained the satellite's ability to track it. It sliced through the cold air, a shadow against the darker shadows of the night, its engine exhaust a faint dissipating smudge on the IR spectrum. In less than 30 seconds from engine start, it had vanished. Not just from sight, but from their most sophisticated radar and thermal tracking systems. It simply disappeared into the clutter of the Arctic night, heading north on a trajectory that was immediately lost in the vast, empty expanse of the polar ice cap. The operations center was left in a silence that was deeper and more profound than before. The screens showed an empty valley, the great stone door now slowly, ponderously grinding shut, sealing the secret once more. The tire tracks, the heat signatures, the open door, it had all been leading to this. The purpose of the hidden airfield was not to launch a relic, it was to launch a revelation. The Phantom Echo was no longer a place, it was a thing that was now loose in the world, its origins, its purpose, and its destination a mystery that promised to rewrite the rules of global power. The night the mountain opened had given birth to a new, terrifying unknown. The silence in the NATO Operations Center was not the quiet of inactivity, but the dense, pressurized stillness that follows a seismic event. On the main screen, the valley was once again a placid, snow-filled basin, the great stone door seamlessly shut, the evidence of the incredible event that had just transpired erased as if it were a dream. But the data was real, the footage was real, the implications were a chilling reality that was now spreading through the highest levels of the alliance like a virus. The initial focused curiosity of the intelligence team at RAF Malmsworth was now a full-blown 5-alarm fire at NATO headquarters in Brussels. The secure briefing room, known as the Aquarium for its soundproof glass walls, was filled with a tension so thick it was difficult to breathe. Air Chief Marshal Sir Alistair Finch, the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, stood before a digital map of Europe, his face a granite mask of controlled alarm. The map was centered not on the familiar Fulda Gap or the Baltic states, but on a region most of the men and women in the room had only ever considered as a transit corridor or a diplomatic abstraction: neutral Austria. The target, Finch's voice cut through the low murmur, designated Phantom Echo, is not, as we initially hypothesized, in a former Warsaw Pact state. It is not in a remote corner of Siberia. He tapped a laser pointer on the map, and a red icon glowed ominously in the heart of the Alps. It is here, the Ötztal Alps, approximately 40 kilometers from the Italian border, deep inside Austrian sovereign territory. A wave of disbelief, followed by cold dread, washed over the room. Austria, a neutral nation since 1955 Austrian State Treaty, a buffer, a peaceful Alpine republic whose military was configured for territorial defense and disaster relief. It was a country that existed in the blind spot of NATO's strategic planning. An attack launched from there was unthinkable. A clandestine military operation conducted from its soil was a violation of the most fundamental tenets of European post-war order. It was the ultimate camouflage. No one was looking there. "This is not a forgotten Soviet base," Finch continued, his tone glacial. "The technology we witnessed is not a relic. It is a generation ahead of anything in our inventory, or that of the Russians or the Chinese, as far as we know. Someone has built, maintained, and now activated a covert military installation of staggering sophistication inside a neutral country. They have launched a highly advanced unmanned combat aerial vehicle from it, a mission no one is claiming, a mission we can no longer track." The panic was not the shouted, running around kind seen in movies. It was far more insidious. It was in the white-knuckled grip of a British admiral on his chair. It was in the way a German general slowly removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. It was in the frantic, hushed conversations between American intelligence officials. Their entire defensive posture, their satellite coverage, their early warning networks were all oriented outward, toward the east, toward the Mediterranean, toward the Arctic approaches. They were designed to see a threat coming from thousands of miles away. They were not designed to find a threat that had already arrived, that was sleeping under their very feet. The fortress of Europe had been breached not by a battering ram at the gate, but by a sapper who had been tunneling under the walls for decades. The hunt for the aircraft, now designated Ghost Rider 01, became the single most urgent priority for Western intelligence. Every asset was tasked. AWACS planes were vectored over the Norwegian and Barents Seas. Aegis destroyers of the U.S. Navy's 6th Fleet tilted their powerful Spy-1 radars to the sky, searching for a whisper in the static. The vast, sprawling network of ground-based radar stations in Norway, Finland, and across the UK strained to find a needle in the haystack of the polar night. And for a breathtaking, heart-stopping moment, they found it. A lonely Norwegian Globus 2 radar array, situated in the far northern region of Finnmark, designed to track space debris and ballistic missiles, caught a flicker. For exactly 2 seconds, a contact appeared on the scopes, moving at a velocity that made the operators initially dismiss it as a ghost, a glitch caused by solar flare activity. But the computer correlation was undeniable. The signature, though faint, matched the profile of the aircraft seen leaving the mountain. It was traveling at Mach 2.4 at an altitude of 85,000 feet on a heading that would take it deep into the Arctic Ocean toward the North Pole. "Track it! Lock it!" the station commander barked. But as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. It didn't vanish from the screen in a fade. It simply ceased to be. One moment it was a solid, confirmed contact. The next, the scopes showed empty sky. "It just vanished, sir," a bewildered operator reported. "No chaff, no decoys, no change in trajectory. It's as if it flew behind a curtain." The curtain was a well-documented, if poorly understood, phenomenon. The Arctic null zone. A region of intense magnetic anomalies, ionospheric disturbances, and powerful auroral activity that played havoc with sensors. It was a navigator's nightmare, and a stealth aircraft's perfect sanctuary. The Ghost Rider had flown straight into it, using the Earth's own electromagnetic chaos as its cloak. Where it went after that, no one knew. The vast, empty expanse of the polar ice cap had swallowed it whole. The mission's objective lay somewhere in that white, trackless void, a secret hidden by nature itself. For 48 hours, there was nothing. The intelligence apparatus of the most powerful military alliance in human history was blind. The frustration was palpable. They had the launch point, They had a fleeting radar contact, but the purpose of the mission, its target, its very nature, remained a maddening enigma. Then a break. A small, highly secretive signals intelligence station operated by the British GCHQ, nestled in the Canadian Rockies to shield it from electronic noise, intercepted a transmission. It was not a long, complex stream of data. It was a burst. A packet of information compressed and fired off in a microsecond burst, designed to be almost impossible to detect or intercept. The station's supercomputers, programmed to listen for such cryptographic anomalies, flagged it. The burst was directed toward the coordinates of the hidden airfield. It was encrypted with an algorithm the analysts had never seen before, a sleek, brutalist piece of code that resisted all standard decryption protocols. It was the digital equivalent of a vault door with no keyhole. But the header of the transmission, the to and from address, was less secure. After 12 hours of brute force computing, they cracked it. The message contained only 3 characters, S-13. It was not a NATO designation. It was not a Russian military call sign. It didn't correspond to any known terrorist group, private military corporation, or intelligence agency in any database going back to the Second World War. Analysts scrambled, cross-referencing everything from Soviet naval records to declassified OSS files. Nothing. The frustration mounted. This wasn't a standard military code. It was too short, too cryptic. It felt less like an official report and more like a signature or a name. A young junior analyst, a history buff with a focus on 20th century special operations, working on a hunch, ignored the modern databases. He went digging in the digital archives of the Bundesarchiv, the German Federal Archive. He searched for S-13 not as a code, but as a unit designation, a project name. And he found it, buried in a scanned, typewritten after-action report from the Abwehr, German military intelligence, dated March 1945. It was a passing reference to a Sonderkommando S-13, a special detachment that reported directly to SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, the shadowy, brilliant, and ruthless head of the Nazi V-weapon program. The report was fragmentary, but it mentioned Kammler's obsession with Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, and his special projects outside the purview of the Reichsminister. S-13 was a ghost even among the ghosts of the collapsing Third Reich. The trail ended there. The analyst's report was filed, considered an interesting historical footnote, but of dubious modern relevance. But the seed was planted. This mission, this impossible aircraft, it wasn't just military, it was personal. It was tied to a name, a legacy, a secret that outlasted the 1,000-year Reich. For 3 days, the mountain remained silent. The valley was monitored around the clock, a silent vigil for a ghost. The tension at NATO HQ began to be tinged with a desperate hope. Perhaps the mission had failed. Perhaps the Ghost Rider was lost, crashed into the ice of the Arctic Ocean. Perhaps the secret had buried itself. On the morning of the 4th day, their hopes were shattered. The same Norwegian radar station that had first glimpsed the aircraft detected it again. It emerged from the null zone not as a sleek predator, but as a wounded animal. Its speed was erratic, fluctuating between Mach 0.5 and Mach 1.2. Its altitude was unstable, porpoising by thousands of feet. The satellite imagery, when they managed to get a visual, was shocking. The sleek, black dagger was scarred and scorched. Great swaths of its radar-absorbent skin were peeled back, revealing the dull gray of composite materials beneath. The entire port-side leading edge of the wing was missing, a jagged, ugly wound that spoke of a catastrophic event. It was trailing a faint, almost invisible mist of coolant or fuel, a ghostly contrail of its own distress. It was heading home. Back in the Carpathian Valley, the great door ground open once more. the mountain yawning to receive its wounded child. The Ghost Rider's approach was not the controlled, precise maneuver of its departure, it was a controlled crash. It came in too fast, too high, and dropped onto the compacted snow of the apron with a jarring impact that sent a cloud of ice crystals billowing into the air. It slewed sideways, one landing gear visibly buckling under the strain, before it ground to a shuddering halt mere meters from the rock face. Immediately, figures swarmed out of the open hangar. Ground crews, dressed in heavy, non-reflective parkas, attached tow bars and dragged the crippled aircraft back into the glowing depths of the mountain. The process was frantic, desperate. The moment the scarred tail section cleared the threshold, the massive door began to close, faster than before, as if eager to hide the evidence of this failure, this brush with death. The door sealed with a final, resonant thud that was felt, not heard, by the watching satellites. The valley was once again a pristine, silent, and empty bowl of snow. But everything had changed. The impossible mission had been flown. It had gone somewhere no one could follow, done something no one could comprehend, and had returned, bearing the brutal, physical scars of a violent encounter. It had barely survived, and the three-character message, S-13, hung in the air, a cryptic clue from a past that refused to stay dead, pointing towards a future that was now more uncertain and more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. The mountain had closed, but the mystery had just been blown wide open. The scarred return of the Ghost Rider was not an end, but a trigger. Inside the mountain, the silence that had reigned for decades was shattered by a new, urgent sound, the sound of an ending. The failed mission had drawn the eye of the world, or at least the eye of those in the world that mattered. The secret was compromised. The clock was now ticking. Alexander Volkov stood in the control room, a chamber carved from the living rock, its walls a tapestry of analog dials, flickering CRT monitors, and wiring looms thick as a man's arm. The air, which usually staled with the smell of ozone and old electronics, was now charged with the acrid scent of panic. The representative from the charter, the man in the modern tactical gear, was no longer cold and professional. He was a cornered animal, his voice a sharp, cracking whip. 24 hours, he snarled into a secure satellite phone, his knuckles white around the handset. We have 24 hours before the political pressure becomes a military probe. Scorch it. Scorch everything. Volkov watched him, a deep, weary resignation settling in his bones. He had known this day would come. Not like this, perhaps, not with this strange, wounded bird and its cryptic mission, but he had always known that Valkator's purpose was temporary. All secrets have a shelf life. He gave the order, his voice echoing through the cavern via the ancient intercom system. Initiate Protocol Crystal. The name was a dark joke from the original builders. Like a crystal, the facility would shatter into a million useless pieces. That followed was not a chaotic rout, but a chillingly efficient ballet of erasure. The great hangar, which had moments before been a scene of frantic repair efforts on the crippled stealth aircraft, transformed into a hive of reverse logistics. The Ghost Rider itself, its secrets too sensitive to move, was targeted for primary destruction. Specialized teams, their faces obscured by masks, swarmed over it, not to fix, but to strip. They unbolted avionics bays, pulling out black boxes that were immediately fed into industrial shredders. They drained its exotic fuel into containment tanks to be mixed with chemical agents that would render it inert sludge. Its unique engine, a masterpiece of propulsion, was targeted for thermite charges. Meanwhile, the other assets were prepped for movement. The two anachronistic Antonov AN-2s, the Hercules, Volkov's old companion, presented a more complex problem. It was too big to move, too identifiable to leave. He walked through its cavernous cargo bay one last time, his hand brushing against the cold metal wall, feeling the ghosts of 100 clandestine flights. He personally oversaw the placement of the shaped charges along its main spar and in its cockpit. They would ensure it became a tomb, not a trophy. Files that had been kept in pressurized, climate-controlled vaults were fed into incinerators, the flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the cavern walls. Hard drives were pulverized by magnetic degaussers and then physically smashed. The hum of the generators, the lifeblood of the facility for half a century, began to stutter and die as fuel lines were cut and control systems were wiped. One by one, the strings of lights flickered and went out, plunging sections of the complex into an abyssal darkness it had not known since its construction. From above, the NATO satellites saw it all. They saw the heat signatures of the trucks arriving and leaving via a previously hidden road that switchbacked down the other side of the mountain. They saw the thermal blooms of the incinerators working overtime. They saw the frantic movement, the loading, the stripping. It was an evacuation, but it was silent. No radio chatter, no identifying markings on the vehicles, no uniforms. It was a ghost army dismantling its own haunted house. Then came the explosions. They were not the single, cataclysmic detonation of a self-destruct charge. That would have been too messy, too likely to cause geological instability that might attract the wrong kind of scientific attention. These were controlled, precise, and deeply professional. They started at the deepest point of the complex, in the power plant and fuel storage areas. A series of deep, muffled thumps that sent tremors through the mountain, felt by seismic monitors 100 miles away. On the satellite feed, plumes of dust and smoke, superheated by the contained blasts, jetted from cleverly disguised ventilation shafts high on the mountain peak. Then the charges in the hangars detonated. The great arched ceilings, engineered to withstand a direct hit from a tactical nuclear weapon from the outside, were vulnerable from within. The shaped charges placed on the Hercules blew its spine, the colossal airframe collapsing in on itself in a shower of fire and torn metal. The thermite charges on the Ghost Rider's engine ignited, burning at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the advanced machinery into a molten, unrecognizable slag. The Antonovs, now just pieces on trucks, were already miles away. Finally, the structural charges were triggered. These were placed at key load-bearing points throughout the tunnel network. The result was a series of progressive, grinding collapses. The entrance tunnel, the great hangar bay, the living quarters, the command center, one after another, they were consumed by thousands of tons of falling rock. The mountain was quite literally eating its own secret. Within an hour, the thermal signatures that had first betrayed the facility faded, then died completely, as the crushing rock snuffed out the fires and buried the heat. The valley was, once again, cold, silent, and empty. The hidden airfield had been surgically removed from the face of the earth. Months passed. The political storm over the Carpathian incident was contained behind closed doors. Publicly, nothing happened. Privately, the intelligence war raged. The trucks had been tracked to a point, then vanished, their license plates clones, their transponder signals ghosting in and out of existence. The charter had melted back into the shadows. The mystery of the Ghost Rider and its mission to the Arctic remained, a festering wound in the intelligence community's side. It was late summer when a covert team was finally given the green light. They were not soldiers, but a mixed unit of CIA SAD operatives and British SBS commandos, dressed as geological surveyors. They moved in on foot, their equipment disguised as scientific gear. They found nothing. The valley was as pristine as the maps had always shown. It took them a week of painstaking reconnaissance, using ground-penetrating radar and seismic sensors to find what was left. The entrance was gone, filled with a seamless plug of shattered rock that had fused together in the heat of the demolition. They eventually located a fissure, a crack in the mountain face created by the internal collapses, leading to an unstable-looking debris pile. It took another 2 days of careful, dangerous work to clear a path big enough for a single person to squeeze through. What they found on the other side was a tomb. The air was thick with dust and the smell of cold stone and burnt metal. Their helmet lamps cut beams through the absolute black, illuminating a landscape of utter destruction. The great hangar was a chaotic jumble of collapsed concrete and granite boulders. Twisted rebar stuck out like the broken bones of a giant. Here and there they could see a piece of recognizable debris, a shredded tire from the Hercules, a fragment of its distinctive T-tail, a lump of congealed, blackened metal that was all that remained of the stealth aircraft. It was a forensic dead end. Every piece of equipment, every document, every shred of evidence had been pulverized, melted, or buried under millions of tons of rock. The demolition had been terrifyingly thorough. It was on the 3rd day of their subterranean exploration, while probing a side tunnel that had partially survived, that the team leader's boot struck something that clanged, a hollow metallic sound alien in the crushing silence. Brushing away the dust and rubble, they uncovered it, a box. It was not large, about the size of a small footlocker. It was made of a dull gray hardened steel, its seams welded shut. It was scarred and scorched from the explosions, but had miraculously survived the collapse of the tunnel around it. On its front was not a lock, but a numerical keypad, its display dark. It was a digital code seal, the kind used for transporting top-secret materials. It was the one man-made object in the entire complex that had been designed to survive. The box was carefully, reverently extracted from the rubble and flown under the tightest security to a CIA black site in Germany. For 2 weeks, the agency's top cryptologists and technicians worked on it. They couldn't brute force the code without triggering an internal white mechanism. X-rays and gamma scans couldn't penetrate the dense alloy. It was a perfect secret. The breakthrough came from the junior analyst from GCHQ, the one who had found the S-13 reference. He had been brought onto the team for his historical insight. He proposed a theory. The facility was Soviet-era. Its builders were men of a certain time with a certain mindset. They often used personal, memorable numbers, not random computer-generated strings. He suggested trying dates. The date of the October Revolution, the date of the Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War. Nothing. Then he had a darker thought. He suggested the date of the death of Lavrenti Beria, the hated head of the NKVD. The men who built this place, the Zeks, the prisoners, would have celebrated that day. It was a number that would have been whispered in the barracks, a small act of defiance. The lead technician, skeptical, input the digits 1, 2, 2, 3, 5, 3. The day Beria was executed. There was a soft, definitive click. The seal was broken. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, were not jewels or advanced circuitry. It was a stack of old-fashioned paper flight logs, their pages brittle and yellowing, and a single, modern, solid-state data drive. The logs were handwritten in a precise Cyrillic script, detailing decades of clandestine flights in and out of Volcator. But it was the data drive that held the prize. It contained the complete flight record of the ghostwriter's final, fateful mission. Analysts pored over the data. The flight path was reconstructed. It showed the aircraft's terrifyingly fast climb out of the Carpathians, its transit across the Barents Sea, its disappearance into the Arctic null zone, and then its reappearance. The coordinates it had navigated to, the location it had orbited, the place where it had encountered something that had torn its wing apart, were not in the middle of the empty ocean. The coordinates were plugged into the global database. The result sent a visceral, cold shock through every person in the room. The location was a cluster of small, barren, ice-locked islands in the Franz Josef Land archipelago. And on the largest of those islands, the maps, both public and classified, showed the decaying infrastructure of a Soviet-era military complex. Radar Station Nagurskoye 4. a facility that, according to all official records, had been decommissioned, stripped of all valuable equipment, and abandoned to the polar bears and the elements 10 years before the Ghost Rider's mission. The hidden analysts worked in shifts, their world shrinking to the glow of monitors and the whisper of translation software. The logs penned by Alexander Volkov himself began with the reactivation of Volcatur. They detailed the arrival of the Charter, a name that appeared again and again, always in quotes, as if Volkov himself did not grant it the legitimacy of a true organization. He wrote of the pressure, the cynicism, the vast sums of money that flowed through shadowy channels to resurrect the slumbering giant of the mountain. But the heart of the mystery was in the mission profile for Operation Shadow Catch. The objective was not destruction, it was not reconnaissance, it was retrieval. An extraction from deep inside territory so sensitive, so heavily monitored, that any official incursion would be an act of war. The target was not stored in a vault or a laboratory. It was housed in a barracks. The asset was classified with a code name that now made a terrible human sense, S-13. It was a person. The logs described a figure, a scientist or an engineer, who had been part of a program so black it had no paper trail even within the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Soviet military-industrial complex. This individual, this S-13, had been the lead theoretical mind behind a project known only as Zolotoy Pero, the Golden Pen. It was not a missile or a bomb. It was a concept, a radical new form of propulsion, a way to harness atmospheric plasma for sustained hypersonic flight. It was the theory that could have made the Ghost Rider not just a stealth aircraft, but something else entirely, a spacecraft, a global strike vehicle that could render all existing air defenses obsolete. But the S-13 had a crisis of conscience. He had seen the direction his work was taking, the balance of power it would irrevocably shatter, and so he had done the unthinkable. He had contacted the West. Not through official channels, but through a tortuous back-channel route that eventually led to the Charter. He wasn't defecting for ideology or for money. He was defecting for absolution. He offered to bury his own life's work. But the problem was, neither side could officially be involved. For NATO to extract him would be an act of aggression, a provocation that could reignite a Cold War that was, in the public mind, already won. For the remnants of the Russian intelligence apparatus to admit he had even existed would be to confess that they had lost control of a Wunderwaffe that could have changed the world. He was a walking, talking secret that both superpowers, in their own way, wanted to vanish. The Charter, this new, stateless entity, saw an opportunity. They had the airfield, they had the plane, they had the deniability. They would perform the surgery that the great powers could not perform. They would pluck S-13 from his icy prison at Nagorsko-4, a place the Russian government had officially written off a decade prior. It was the perfect crime, launched from a place that didn't exist to retrieve a man that didn't exist from a base that didn't exist. The flight logs from the data drive chronicled the Ghost Rider's journey in chilling, automated detail. The penetration into the Arctic null zone was not just to avoid radar, it was the only navigable path, a narrow corridor of calmer magnetic activity the aircraft's AI had calculated. It descended over the Franz Josef Land archipelago, its skin cooling to almost ambient temperature, a ghost drifting over the glaciers. The extraction was not a landing, it was a hover. The Ghost Rider, employing a revolutionary and terrifyingly unstable vertical thrust system, held position a mere 20 meters above the snow-drifted ruins of Nagorsko-4. From a seemingly derelict communications tower, a figure emerged, swaddled in Arctic gear. A winch cable snaked down from the aircraft's belly. The logs noted the exact second the cable was attached, the strain on the engines as the weight was taken, the slow, precarious retraction. And then the disaster. A dormant, battery-powered surface-to-air missile system, left behind not by accident, but as a deliberate automated sentinel, woke up. It was a legacy system, old and slow, But it didn't need to be smart. It was pointed at the one piece of sky directly above the base. It fired a single ungainly missile. The Ghost Rider's automated defenses, designed to counter sophisticated modern radar, were blind to this crude, heat-seeking projectile. It detonated just off the port wing, shredding the leading edge and sending a storm of shrapnel across the fuselage. The aircraft shuddered, its hovering failing. It dropped 10 meters, the winch cable snapping taut and whipping violently before the pilot AI and its remote human operator, likely Volkov himself, wrestled back control. It clawed its way into the sky, trailing fluid and pieces of itself, the asset, S-13, swinging precariously beneath it like a pendulum before being hauled into the bay. The return flight was a nightmare of failing systems and falling speed, a bleeding animal crawling back to its den. The mission was real. The airfield was real. The stakes were beyond anything written in the Cold War history because they were the stakes of the war that came after, a silent, privatized conflict where the ultimate currency was not ideology, but knowledge. And a single man held the key to a power that no nation could be trusted to hold. Years later, after the quietest of diplomatic storms, after the endless closed-door meetings and the unspoken agreements between intelligence agencies to let sleeping dogs lie, a heavily redacted version of the Phantom Echo file was quietly moved to a semi-classified archive. Most of it was black ink. But one paragraph, nestled in an appendix detailing the original 1970 site selection for Volcatur, was left untouched. It was a single, devastating sentence, a footnote that explained everything. The airfield's location was chosen for one reason. From here, no nation could legally claim responsibility. It was the perfect legal loophole, and mission launched from a neutral nation could not be attributed to any power block. It was an act without an author, a bullet fired from a gun with no serial number. The Austrians, if they ever found out, could protest the violation of their sovereignty, but they could not point a finger at Moscow or Washington. It was the ultimate deniability. And so the pieces of the impossible puzzle finally clicked into place, forming a picture of breathtaking cynicism. A mission launched from nowhere, a jet that never officially flew, a person retrieved from a place that didn't exist. The hidden airfield of Volcatur had been the ultimate instrument of this new shadowy era. It had opened its stone mouth only long enough to launch its ghost into the night, to perform one act of surgical, world-altering espionage. It had succeeded, against all odds, in its impossible mission, snatching a single human soul and his terrible knowledge from the grip of the past, and then, recognizing that its existence was now its greatest liability, it had consumed itself, vanishing back into the mountain from whence it came, leaving behind only a scar in the rock, a few tantalizing clues, and a silence that was more profound than any explosion. The Cold War had birthed it, but the confused, amorphous conflict that followed had given it its one true purpose. It was a relic that found its moment not in the grand ideological standoff of the 20th century, but in the murky, privatized battlegrounds of the 21st century. And in doing so, it wrote the final, secret chapter of an era everyone thought they understood. A chapter that would remain buried, known only to a handful of analysts and the silent, watchful mountains forever.